forgetting how to start. And I forgot what I was going to say. Take 4. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Autumn Leigh at Home. I'm Autumn Leigh. Today we are going to have a meal prep day where I meal prep a bunch of baked goods for our freezer. We love having baked goods in the freezer because it's homemade baked bread that I'm able to just pull out of the freezer. It freezes beautifully, it unfreezes beautifully, it does not change the texture at all, as well as muffins or different things like that. Just having it in the freezer is wonderful because it allows me to have that home baked bread and items that are already done on a busy day. So I already did go ahead and prepare a couple of things such as our pumpkin puree. I went ahead and pulled this out of the freezer last night, stuck it in the fridge, and then this morning I pulled it out of the refrigerator to let it continue thawing, as well as prepared my sourdough starter for today. If you do not have a sourdough starter, do not panic. You are still more than welcome to follow along. I am only doing one recipe that requires the sourdough starter, and with that recipe, I will plug it down in the description down below and add a non-sourdough recipe that you could also do the same idea with and just kind of have fun with it. But my 3 main goals for today are to make a roasted garlic Italian seasoning sourdough loaf of bread that, again, this one is sourdough loaf, but I will plug down in the description one that you can use for this recipe or this idea. It's not really a recipe, it's just me kind of having fun in the kitchen, but I will plug another recipe down there that's just for a classic rustic loaf of bread that does not require sourdough. You can do the same thing with that one. So if you still want to follow along, look down in the description, you can get that recipe instead. But that's where I'm starting here, is getting the sourdough ready, and I will go over that in just a moment. My other 2 goals for today for our freezer meal prep day, baking day, is to make pumpkin muffins using our homemade puree from last fall, as well as make a bunch of French loaves of bread. I'm really excited to try all 3 of these. These are ones that I've occasionally done in the past, but I am looking forward to having these meal prepped and made today from scratch to wrap them up, stick them in the freezer for a rainy day. So let's go ahead and get started with our sourdough starter. If you do not already have a sourdough starter, feel free to go ahead and skip ahead to where we begin the recipes. But for those of you that have a sourdough starter or you're wanting to learn about sourdough, this is what a sourdough starter looks like. I pulled it out of the refrigerator the night before and went ahead and fed it that night. And feeding it means that I gave it fresh flour and water, and then I stirred it until it was not clumpy anymore. So when I pull the spoon out, if you see clumps of unmixed flour in there or water, you want all of that to be well combined and well mixed and well incorporated so that when you pull your spoon out, it looks nice and smooth. And I would say, I know Farmhouse on Boone, she talks about it being pancake batter-ish. I would say a little bit thicker than pancake batter. I am by no means a sourdough starter or sourdough expert. However, I think that's kind of the point that I really want to hone in on, is that you don't have to be. This, I have found, is so forgiving, and it's so easy to work with. Once you have it established and you have a routine, that is really the hardest part, is getting a routine of, discarding it as well as using it and keeping it fresh. With this, I went ahead and fed it the night before. I left it on the counter in a warm spot so that it could ferment and get all nice and big and bubbly, and see how smooth it is now. That's what we're really wanting. When you're doing really big baking days like this, it's really important to think about timing of everything. And I really want things to be working for me while I'm working on other items. So thinking about the items or the baked goods that are going to take the longest and need to maybe ferment or rise or proof or anything like that. So to start off, I am going to go ahead and start off with this sourdough recipe. I'm not really sure whose recipe it is. I believe it's Ballerina Farm sourdough recipe. However, it's kind of between that and Farmhouse on Boone's recipe. It's 250 grams of fed active starter, 735 grams of warm water, 1,000 grams of flour, and 24 grams of salt. This recipe in particular, it needs to sit and sit and rise for about 2 hours before I can even start my stretch and folds. So I'm going to go ahead and measure out my starter as well as all of the other ingredients. And then after I have this mixed, I get to sit it on the counter and let it just rise for a little while. It's the next morning and I have my bowl out. I put my bowl on the scale and I tared the weight of the bowl out, which just means that when I put the bowl on the scale, I make it come down to 0 before adding the sourdough starter. That way I get an accurate measurement. As now that my sourdough starter, you saw it's the next morning, so that means it's been rising in the jar or fermenting in the jar for about 6 to 12 hours is what you really want to see. You want big, nice bubbles and a lot of bubbles in the sourdough starter. You may see it go all the way up. If it comes back down a little bit, that is okay. That's not a big deal. Here, I'm just measuring out that 250 grams. That way, with baking, you want to try to be as precise as possible. If you're few grams off, it's not that big of a deal. I think somehow I missed filming this part, but I did also, once I got the 250 grams of sourdough, I tared out the bowl again with the bowl and the sourdough starter. I tared all of that weight out, and then I measured out 735 grams of warm water. That's my Danish dough whisk, and I'm using that. You don't have to have that. You can use a fork or a spoon. All you really want to do is measure the 735 grams of water into the sourdough, take that bowl off, and go ahead and gently mix it together. This recipe in particular makes 2 loaves of sourdough bread, so I'm going to be using this other second bowl anyway, so I figured why not go ahead and measure out the flour into the separate bowl. And you will need 1,000 grams of flour, and I'm using bread flour, but you can use a different flour if you wish. The bread flour just has a lot more rise capability. It's more suited because it has more gluten for bread baking. I measured out the flour separately because I wanted my daughter to get to help, and it's a lot easier to fix it if she were to accidentally dump in way too much flour. So now that I have that, I went ahead and poured it in with the other and go ahead and start gently mixing it together. If you have little ones, it's best if you turn their hands this way, and that way they can stir this way and you don't have to worry about them going like this with the spoon and accidentally slinging the ingredients everywhere. They still may get it out sometimes, but it's not near as often as if you have their hand turned this way. Watching this back, in full disclosure, I think I totally forgot to add the 24 grams of salt, which I haven't tasted the bread yet, so I will let you guys know how that is. The salt is pretty important for the recipe, so make sure you remember to add the salt. Don't do what I did and forget. I think I planned to add it later on when I added the roasted garlic and the Italian seasoning, and I don't remember actually doing it. So we will see as we get further along in the video. However, now that I have that covered, I put it in a warm place to allow it to rise for the next 2-ish hours. It does not have to be exact or precise. It's not an exact science. Just put it in a warm area of your house. The warmer it is, the faster it will rise. The colder it is, the longer it will take to rise. This is the kind of timing that if you need to go somewhere or you need to do something, once you have it mixed like I do, you can actually wrap it in a plastic bag and stick it in the fridge and maybe come back even the next day to go ahead and do it. But because it's sourdough, the longer you let it sit, the more it's fermenting and the taste gets a lot stronger. So if you're not used to sourdough, make sure you bake it pretty quickly so that you don't get a super strong fermentation taste. That will help you out a good bit. Now that that is rising and in a warm spot, we are moving on to my French loaves, and I am currently proofing the yeast to let that proof and get all nice and bubbly in the microwave. And here are the instructions or the ingredients that you need. What you just saw me mixing were the ingredients for the French loaves. The first 3 ingredients, you need to mix 2 cups of warm water, about 105 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 tablespoon of active dry yeast, and 2.5 tablespoons of, or teaspoons, excuse me, 2.5 teaspoons of granulated sugar. This is what you just saw me mixing, and I put it in the microwave to allow it to proof, which means that the yeast becomes activated and nice and bubbly on top. That's what we want to see. I put that in the microwave, but I did not turn the microwave on. I just find that my microwave stays a lot warmer than my house, and so I just sit it in there without the microwave being on and let it proof. While that is happening, I start mixing my 5 cups of all-purpose flour. However, again, I use bread flour, but you can use either one. 2.5 teaspoons of table salt, As you can see on top, now it's nice and bubbly. So once I let it proof for about 5 to 10 minutes and it becomes bubbly on top, and the other items get mixed in the mixer with your bread hook, you can go ahead and start pouring all of it in together. I slowly added the flour. I did 4 cups at one time and then I added that 5th cup. This recipe makes 2 loaves of French bread. I doubled it. So what you see here is a large amount of dough compared to what you will probably see in your kitchen when you make this. Again, I will link the recipe down in the description so you can kind of go read through it. I doubled it, so I wanted to make 4 loaves since I was already dirtying up all of these bowls. It was kind of nice because a lot of the measuring cups and all of that I was able to reuse. So that's the beauty of baking everything all in one day, is you're not dirtying up multiple dishes multiple times. You're able to dirty up all the dishes in one moment and use some of those dishes more than once so that you're not having to make even more dirty dishes. It makes it nice. It's so that you can go ahead and put it in the freezer for a day that life gets maybe crazier, but you wanted home cooked or home baked bread. When mixing all of the ingredients that I just mentioned, maybe leave the olive oil out because that is actually not mixed in with the dough. That's what you use to spread on the bowl to help the dough not stick to the bowl. And then you're also going to put a little bit of olive oil kind of gently over the top. Here, when I was dumping it out of the bowl, I realized that I thought I had it all mixed up using the mixer. However, once I dumped it out, I realized there was pockets of flour underneath that did not get mixed. So I just took the time to knead all of this by hand, and it turned out just fine. I didn't have any problems with that. The recipe actually calls for you to mix it in the mixer and or knead it by hand. So I did a little bit of both, but you can do one or the other as well. If you do not like getting your hands dirty, working with dough and baking may not be the best thing for you. It can be very messy. I will say that's part of the reason I like it, and you get kind of used to learning how to work with the dough and tips and tricks that maybe help. So, wetting your hands, I did not do this before this stretch and fold or kind of getting the dough to get into a ball shape. I did not do that beforehand, and obviously it is majorly sticking to my hands. So you learn those tips and tricks that make things a little bit easier as time goes on. Putting a little bit of oil on your hands, a little bit of flour, those are also things that you can do. You just have to be really careful not to do it too much of any of those ingredients because otherwise it changes the texture or the outcome of your dough. After finally getting it in a somewhat ball shape, I went ahead and put a little bit of oil on it to prevent it from drying out, and then put a clean dish towel over it and sat it next to the other sourdough loaf that is also rising. And remember again to sit both of them in a warm place, which my oven is preheating and warming up, and I also cooked lunch, so all of that area along my counter is pretty warm. So that's where I sat both of these. And now it is finally time to clean and put my daughter down for a nap. I have my daughter down for a nap, and these are rising. I went ahead and got them mixed while I was putting her down, or before I put her down, and now they're rising while she was going down. So this is going to be our roasted garlic sourdough loaf that with Italian seasoning, and this is going to be our French loaves. And then I'm also going to do some pumpkin muffins. And while these are rising, I'm going to be doing some stretch and folds while I'm mixing our pumpkin muffins. One of the important things with when you're doing a bunch of baking is trying to time it out to where things are kind of working for you while you're working on other items, and that way you can get a lot done. It's been about 2 hours since I originally mixed the sourdough loaf. So this is the sourdough loaf that we are working on. The French loaves, that dough does not need to be stretched and folded right now. That only needs to sit for 30 minutes to an hour. However, the sourdough loaf, which is what I'm currently stretching and folding, it sat for 2 hours, and now I'm going to try to do stretch and folds about every 30 minutes. It is not an exact science. It doesn't have to be perfect, but when you stretch and fold, all you do is you want to gently bring it up and kind of let it stretch out and then fold it over, and you want to turn the bowl 1/4 of the way around, pull it up, stretch it over, fold it down, and you're going to do that 4 times total. Once you've stretched and folded it 4 times, cover it back up with your clean dish towel. Again, sit it back in a warm spot, and you're going to revisit it in about 30 minutes. In the meantime, while I'm waiting for that to rise for another 30 minutes, I am going to slice my garlic in very thin slices and then put it on this pan right here and roast it on low broil, so that all I want is a nice gently brown look to it and gently roasted. It can roast pretty quickly, so you want to make sure that you're standing there watching it. But in the meantime, while those are roasting, it's been about 30 minutes. It took me that long to cut and slice the garlic, but it is time to do our second stretch and fold. So again, 4 times total. You're just going to pull up gently, rotate the bowl 90 degrees or 1/4 of the way around, stretch and fold, and do that 4 times total. Cover it back up and set it back in a warm place again. Our garlic is gently browned, or lightly browned and roasted, so it is ready. I'm going to sit it on the counter off to the side for when I'm ready for it and let it kind of cool in the meantime. Now it's time we get to go back to our French loaves, because it's been a good hour since I originally mixed it. This one, you don't have to do stretch and folds, but because it makes a total of 4 loaves, I do have to separate it out and quarter it out into 4 separate loaves. And then each loaf I am going to fold into the shape that I want it. And that, again, it's just kind of playing around with what works. I found that folding it, the sides ends up in, and then just kind of rolling it onto itself until it's about the length of a log. You want to make it about the length and size that you want it to be once it's done cooking. It will rise and grow a little bit in the oven as it bakes, and as it rises more once you cut it and sit it on the counter for another 30 minutes to an hour. But for the most part, you want it about the length that you're going to want it once it's done baking. I have my parchment paper out. You don't have to use parchment paper, but I have found it helps the bread not burn on the very bottom, and it helps it not stick to anything. But I do go ahead and spray it gently with some Pam or nonstick spray, and I am gently stretching out the bread. I don't want to pull too hard or too much, because it already is proof some, and it has some nice beautiful bubbles and air pockets in it. And the more you stretch it and the more you mess with it, the more those air pockets and bubbles in the dough go away. So I'm gently just pulling it out a little bit, and then I'm going to fold the ends up on each side and then gently kind of just roll it on itself to create that nice log shape. Once you do this, you want to gently pick it up and kind of squish it together a little bit, depending on how long or what shape you want your bread loaves to be in. I want mine a little bit thicker in the center. I don't want them more like baguettes. I want them French loaves, which is a little bit thicker. So once I do that, I am kind of just double checking there all the size and shape that I want. And I'm going to cover them with a damp paper towel so that they do not dry out. And then I'll sit them on a warm place next to the other dough that is still rising. And we will let these rise for another 30 minutes to an hour. Once they are done in 30 minutes to an hour, it will be time to score them and bake them. So they are getting very close to being finished. As these are rising, it's time to move back to our sourdough loaf, because it's almost time for our third stretch and fold. Because of that, I am adding my Italian seasoning as well as my roasted garlic. And again, I don't see that I added my salt, so hopefully they still turn out okay and the taste will be fine. I'm thinking that the Italian seasoning, between that and the roasted garlic, flavor-wise, I should be okay, but the salt really does have a big impact in it. So we will see. I will try it one day when I cut into it out of the freezer, and I will let you guys know how it turned out. But once I add the roasted garlic, literally all you do is dump it in, and then I eyeballed it. I didn't measure out my Italian seasoning. I guess I added about a tablespoon or so, give or take. But again, this recipe makes 2 loaves of sourdough bread. You don't have to wait until this stretch and fold to add in whatever seasonings it is you want. And you don't have to use Italian seasoning or roasted garlic. That was just one that I tried in the past recently that I and my family fell in love with. The bread got gone really fast. I shared it with some friends and they ate it all up immediately. So I was really excited to see that, and I was excited that my family loved it too. So we just really wanted to revisit this flavor because we just really, really liked it. Now that we're on the third stretch and fold, I did go ahead and separate it into the two loaves. You can tell that the sourdough starter or the sourdough is not quite there yet when you're doing the stretch and folds. When you pull it all the way up and it starts to break apart, that means it's not quite ready yet. You want to continue to allow it to rise and do the stretch and folds, and we are going to let it proof for a long time again after the 4 separate stretch and folds. This recipe in particular is a very wet dough. You can tell with how sticky it is and that it's kind of sticking to everything. If you're new to bread making or sourdough making, I would maybe try to find a recipe that isn't quite as sticky, because then you may not get quite as frustrated with it and want to continue doing it. So the rustic loaf that is from Becky at Acre Homestead, that's her recipe that I will put down in the description. It's not one I'm baking today, but I do bake it all the time. I will put that down in the description. That calls for like a shaggy dough, and it's not near as difficult to work with. So that might be a good place to start. I am cleaning up my workspace really quick and trying to kind of get reorganized and reset. Both of my sourdough loaves are now rising on the oven and or on the stove. My French loaves are also rising over there because it's nice and warm, so everything's rising. Once I have this cleaned up, it is time for me to start baking our pumpkin muffins. This recipe, the pumpkin muffin recipe, calls for 1 1/2 cups of all-purpose flour, and this time I do use the all-purpose flour. It calls for 1 teaspoon of baking powder, 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda, 1/2 teaspoon of salt, 1 teaspoon of pumpkin pie spice, and all 5 of those first ingredients will be mixed together first. Then it calls for 1 15-ounce can of pure pumpkin or homemade puree, which is what we will be using, and I scale that out and measure it out so that I have the correct amount. Then it calls for 1/3 cup of vegetable oil, 2 large eggs, and 1 1/4 cup of sugar plus 1 tablespoon of sugar and 1 teaspoon of cinnamon. So the 1 tablespoon of sugar and 1 teaspoon of cinnamon leave out of the mixture because that will be mixed together to sprinkle on top. But the recipe itself calls for 1 1/4 cup of sugar itself. After fixing the first 5 ingredients of the pumpkin muffin recipe, I pause because it's time for us to score our French loaves, and I just do 3 quick cuts across the top and stick them in the oven at 400 degrees. These then bake at 400 degrees for about 17 minutes. If they start looking brown, you can cover them up a little bit with foil. In this moment of pause, I go ahead and do our 4th and final stretch and fold for the sourdough loaf while the French bread is in the oven, and we are currently at a good pausing point with the pumpkin muffins. I don't know if you can see it really well, but when I pull and stretch it really thin, you can kind of start to see veining in there, and it doesn't start pulling apart. So that's how you know it's looking pretty good. That's the texture that you want to see with your sourdough. After the 4th and final set of stretch and folds, you want to cover them back up, sit them in a warm place on the stove or wherever it is warm in your house to let them rise. Do the final rise for 1 to 4 hours, and you want to see them kind of double in size and get nice and bubbly and big. Let me tell you guys, the smell of that roasted garlic in the bread is wonderful. It was making me want to eat it right away after I baked it, but it smelled fantastic. Now that that is rising and doing the last rise, we are getting back to our pumpkin muffins and measuring out the puree. So this is the homemade pumpkin puree that I made last fall, and then I froze it. So after it thawed, I'm measuring out 15 ounces. I tared the bowl out so that weight wasn't in there, and measured out the 15 ounces, and then I'm going to be mixing the rest of my ingredients. In the stand mixer, you're going to mix together your pumpkin puree, the oil, the eggs, and the 1 1/4 cup of sugar, with again leaving that other smaller portion out. You're going to mix this together on low speed until it becomes nice and kind of silky smooth looking. Once my wet ingredients are all nice and mixed and incorporated, I'm slowly adding my dry ingredients to the wet mixture, and that way they're all mixing in together. While I'm doing this and allowing those to mix after I got them all poured into the stand mixer together, it is time to take our French loaves out, and they are looking beautiful. So these turned out great. I'm just going to sit them on the counter and let them cool while I slowly pour out all of the pumpkin puree into the muffin tins. Just make sure that you spray these really well. These I have had no problem with freezing. I put them in about 9 fit in a gallon size Ziploc baggie flat if you're laying them flat and you don't double stack them, which I typically don't just because I want them to do well freezing. I don't want them to start getting smushed or sticking together. The only thing I would say about these, because you put the sugar and cinnamon topping on top, that doesn't always look as pretty as it did when it first came out of the oven when you take them out of the freezer and let them thaw. So the taste is completely the same. You can still taste the sugar and cinnamon on top, and the taste is still beautiful. However, the look of them is a little bit different. They almost have an oily appearance, and that hasn't bothered my kids or myself in the least at all. To be honest, it hasn't fazed them one bit. They still love them. The taste and texture is still the same. So we still continue to do it. But if that seems to be something that may bother you, just kind of be aware that that may happen. Once your muffins are in your muffin tin, go ahead and preheat your oven to 350 degrees, and you're going to put the muffins in the 350 degree oven for about 20 to 25 minutes. About halfway to 2/3 of the way through, I pulled them out for just a moment and sprinkled the 1 teaspoon of cinnamon mixed with 1 tablespoon of sugar, and I just sprinkled them over each one and then put them back in the oven to finish up. After the pumpkin muffins were finished, it was time for me to push the pause button and go get my kids from school. So we were finished with our French loaves, our pumpkin muffins, and our sourdough loaves were still rising on the counter. So it was just a good spot to pause and restart later. We are almost finished. I have one more thing to bake, and that's the sourdough loaf. I went ahead and I did one, so you can see it right here. I went ahead and finished one. This is our very last one, and then we're all done with the baking day. So with that being said, all I have to do left is flour the top of this, then score it. I have my oven preheated to 425 degrees with my Dutch oven inside already, and the lid is on. You want to make sure that you allow the Dutch oven to preheat with the oven and maybe keep it in there for at least 30 minutes preheating. That way it gets nice and hot. You want steam, and I'll show you in just a moment a little trick that I use to add a little bit more steam just to get that crunchy, crusty loaf of bread, which is wonderful. I've started doing this trick. I'm sure other people do it too. I've never seen anybody do it, but it's a little trick I use, and I tried it one time just because I was afraid there wasn't enough steam, and ever since then we just really like the texture of the crust on the outside of the sourdough. So I'm gonna do it again, and I'll show you guys what I do. I'm just gonna give it a quick score now that I have my flour on top, and all that does is allow the dough to expand in the oven, and you'll get to see that pretty design, whatever design you want. This dough is just I would say a very moist dough. It's a very wet dough. So I'm not gonna score hardcore. I'm just gonna do a quick X on top like I did with the other one, and that worked out great last time. So I just did a quick X on top. And you can do all kinds of pretty designs, but again, this recipe, the dough is just very wet, and so I wouldn't recommend that. Now that I have this scored, I'm gonna pull my Dutch oven out of the oven, and I got a little bit of water here, and I'm just gonna add a little bit to the outside of the parchment paper once I get the Dutch oven out, and you'll see what I'm talking about. I've been letting this dough rise on the counter for hours now in the warmest area I could find without it causing it to cook. You don't want it to cook on the counter, but because I've been cooking dinner, my stove is warm as well as baking the French loaves. The stove just stayed really warm all day, so this was able to rise really well. So now I would strongly recommend taking your glove, and when you lift this off, leave your glove on top. You may not be able to see that, but leave your glove on top because it's really easy to accidentally grab that lid and forget that it's super, super hot. So I'm gonna take my scored dough, and it's gonna stick to the bowl, so you just kind of have to be careful. There we go. I'm gonna drop it down in here, and now I'm gonna just pour a little bit of water on the outside of the parchment to the bottom of the Dutch oven, and that way it causes it to have a little bit of steam. So I'm gonna do it and then put the lid on really quick. And I have found that that just adds a little bit more steam and causes it to have that beautiful crusty loaf on the outside. Now it's in the oven, I'm gonna set my timer for 25 minutes. I have my timer set for 25 minutes. Once the timer goes off, I'm gonna take the lid off and leave it in for at least another 10 minutes. Y'all, we are finished. I am finished with all of the baking for today. We got a lot done. I just want to say thank you so much for joining me today here at Autumn Leigh at Home. Please like, subscribe, and share down below. We were able to accomplish 4 French loaves of bread, 23 pumpkin muffins, as well as 2 roasted garlic Italian seasoning sourdough loaves of bread. I am tired, but so thankful because now I can put these, wrap them up, put them in the freezer, and save them for a day where maybe life is just a little bit crazier. Please like, subscribe, and share down below, and I hope to see you guys next time.